Castle of St. Donat, or the History of Jack Smith, Volume 3, Chapter 1. Epigraph. Have I laid my brain in the sun and dried it, that it wants matter to prevent such gross overreaching as this? The Merry Wives of Windsor. When the advice is pleasing, we think it good, even if it comes from fools. Marmaduke had won on the former evening and pressed our hero to try his luck. This had induced him to pay Mrs. Leary another visit, and congratulating himself on his prudent determination of only taking 20 guineas, he overlooked the folly of going at all. Smith was very successful. In a few hours he had won 40 guineas and was playing on, when a person who proved to be Lord Carmine tapped him on the shoulder and asked him if he would take a few hands at piquet. Smith, who wished to see something more of his new acquaintance, soon after joined him. They began playing for their former sum, but soon increased their stake, and before supper Smith had lost 30 of the 60 guineas in his pocket. After the supper, Lord Carmine said he should not stay much longer, and would play one game for the sum he had won. Smith, eager to retrieve his losings, consented, and lost the whole. Lord Carmine, observing him rather fretted, offered to stay and play another, when Smith candidly told him that he had no more cash in his pocket. "That," said his lordship, "is of no consequence. Come, we'll play for another 30, and if I don't see you before you go abroad, it is of no consequence." But Smith, in the way of conversation, had mentioned his situation in the army. Our hero, after a faint demur, accepted the offer, but his lordship still won, and Smith at the end of the play had lost 40 guineas, besides the 20 he had originally brought with him. Lord Carmine would on no account take the last 30 guineas he had in his pockets, and accepted, after a few apologies, his draft for 110 guineas. The same morning Smith was to return to his regiment. How changed were his sensations from what they were a few hours before! He knew he had not 100 guineas in the world, but he determined to scrape together as much as he possibly could, and at least pay some part of this honourable debt before he left England, and explain the cause and apologise to his lordship for the remainder. Marmaduke Pendragon, of whose regard for veracity we need not be reminded, had, when he first introduced Smith, informed Mrs. Leary that he, Smith, was a young man of great expectations, but that having disobliged his friends by an imprudent connection which he had formed at Oxford, they wished him to go abroad for some years to wean him from the object of his affection. This was the real motive for his going into the army, and that as soon as he was of age he intended to return to England and take possession of a considerable estate in Wales. 3 motives or causes induced Mr. Marmaduke to invent this story. First, his natural antipathy to the plain truth. Secondly, to get into the favour of his fashionable cousin by bringing her a fresh bird of such hopeful plumage. And thirdly, to enhance his own consequence, and make himself appear a man of great connections. Such was the tale that Mrs. Leary had told Lord Carmine. Few ladies, in telling a story, diminish. It is not to be wondered at, then, that Lord Carmine should consider our hero as no unpleasant adversary to pass a few hours with. His lordship had soon noticed that Smith was not at all deficient in sense, and in a general knowledge of the game, but he knew none of those fine strokes which only a possessor is capable of understanding, and in which his lordship was so truly an adept. Lord Carmine treated Smith as the skilful angler does the more noble of the finny race. He gently played with him at first, and while he seemed to give him his liberty, cautiously drew him in by gradual and almost imperceptible degrees. On Smith's arrival at his quarters, he found the regiment was ordered immediately to P to be on board, without loss of time, and sail with the first fair wind. He therefore got together in the greatest haste what money he was able, and set off again to town, determined to be back and follow the troop as soon as he had paid Lord Carmine. Without loss of time he returned to London, but when there knew not where to find his lordship. He therefore, very unwillingly, waited till the evening, and determined, if he did not meet him at the faro bank, to leave the money with Mrs. Leary. The doors were not opened till a late hour, and with the utmost anxiety he was the first that entered. Mrs. Leary was surprised to see him so soon. He stated the reason, that he had a small sum of money for Lord Carmine, and wished to make his apologies for not bringing a larger. In truth, the cause that had induced Smith to pay the money in person was the smallness of the sum. But as Lord Carmine was not there, he begged Mrs. Leary to pay it for him. That lady told him that his lordship would be there in a few minutes, and particularly wished to speak to him. Smith reluctantly waited. His lordship soon came, but when the youth offered the cash, which was but £50, he absolutely refused to take it, saying with a laugh and producing his note that he had a very good security and would not distress him on any account. By the by, continued his lordship, you say you are going back to your quarters directly, and in the morning set off after your regiment. I'll take you in my carriage as far as Vauxhall. I am engaged to meet a choice party there this evening. I wish you would have made one. But, my dear fellow, you shall absolutely take a farewell look before you leave old England. A servant now informed his lordship that the carriage would be ready in 1/4 but that one of the wheels was a little hurt and was repairing. In the meantime, said Lord Carmine, addressing himself to Smith, you and I can play a hand for some of the Spanish dollars. The first prize money of my young captain will set all right again. There was something very seducing in the latter part of his speech. It raised new ideas in our hero's mind, and those far from being unpleasant. Besides, the easy good humour of Lord Carmine and his accommodating politeness were gratifying to a young, unsuspicious mind. But above all, pshaw, reader, in any period of thy life hast thou ever gamed? If thou hast, thou wilt scarcely condemn the youth. If not, I shall not attempt to convince thee that Smith, like 99 out of 100, made but very little difficulty in accepting the offer. I hasten to finish this ungrateful part of my tale. In short, when Smith rose from the table, he found himself in debt to Lord Carmine £2,000. He bit his lips with agitation and indignantly walked up the room. Lord Carmine also bit his, but from a very different motive, to suppress the least appearance of triumph, and coolly viewed himself in a glass. In a few minutes, Smith came up to his lordship. My lord, said he, I've played the fool sufficiently, and I hope I may soon be able to repay you. As he spoke, he was about to depart, but Lord Carmine seized him by the arm. Indeed, I will not part with you so. My carriage has been ready some time. You shall take a peep at Vauxhall. As for the money, don't trouble yourself a moment about it. Your note and honour is as good as your cash. Your words, added his lordship laughing, may be prophetic. It may be your turn to make me play the fool next. Smith weakly excused himself on account of his wish to be at his quarters that night, and Lord Carmine rejoined, Well, if you are determined, take but one peep, and my carriage shall carry you on to K. His lordship, as he finished his speech, took our hero's arm, who, yielding a silent consent, stepped into the carriage, and the gentlemen drove off together. Chapter 2. Epigraph. Come away, frail, feeble, fleshly wight. Ne let vain words bewitch thy manly heart, ne devilish thoughts dismay thy constant sprite. In heavenly mercies hast thou not a part? Why shouldst thou then despair, that chosen art? Where justice grows, there grows a greater grace. The which doth quench the brand of hellish smart, and that accursed handwriting doth deface. Arise, Sir Knight, arise, and leave this cursed place. Spenser. Lord Carmine and our hero were soon at Vauxhall. As they entered the gardens, a man, dressed much beyond the common style, approached him with, My lord, we have been expecting you an age. Well, Scotty, said his lordship, where are the girls? Then, introducing our hero, My good friend, Mr. Smith, said he, smiling, this is the Marquis of Scorton. The Marquis bowed very low. Smith looked surprised, and concluded if this was the messenger, the rest of the company were of the very first rank. In the midst of his cogitation, he received a smart slap upon his shoulders, and hastily turning, he met the well-known face of Mrs. Sherville. 3 other ladies were with her. His lordship, turning at the same time, cried out, Ah, my dear angels, how are you? Well, Smith, you have found an acquaintance. Need I introduce you to the rest? Where's your box? I'm most confounded hungry. Have you ordered any supper? Scorty, if you have not got us a famous one, you shall spin for it. With such neat conversation, the party retired to a box. Smith began to look about him, and though he had never seen 4 more beautiful women, the eldest of the ladies seemed to be his fair inamorata, and what his opinion was of her, we have before heard. Smith was seated in the middle. He wished to drive away thought, and the champagne was not negligently passed by. He soon succeeded in forcing his spirits, became in high glee, laughed and joked and chattered most immoderately. Still, it was not natural. It was but a fever of the mind. Yet such as it was highly gratifying to the rest of the company. Smith's good sense, his improved education, his ready flow of wit and keen satire, kept his auditors in an uproar. At supper time, a young lad about 15, Lord Carmine's youngest brother, joined them. He was just come post from Eton, and was to be back again by the roll call in the morning. The wild liveliness of youth, spurred on by novelty, gave a zest to the conversation, and Smith once hinted something about his quarters, the young one laughing, calling his brother truant. "Carpe diem, sir," said he, "is my motto." And by his warm addresses to the youngest fair one, he showed he was by no means ignorant of his company. Long before supper was over, our hero had driven away all intruding cares. In the midst of a high-flown compliment directed to the fair Chervil, he cast his eyes at random, vacuously before him. At that instant, they were riveted to an object which struck him like a flash of lightning to the heart. It was no other than Miss Maudley, with her lover and father. The father was in the act of pointing out to his daughter and Sir Sandy. Instinctively, Smith started up from his seat. The wanton Miss Chervil pulled him back by his coat, and the Maudley party, perceiving themselves noticed, walked away. "What, you know those good people?" said Mrs. Chervil. "Yes," stammered our youth. "Oh, so do I," added the lady. "Miss Maudley and myself were born in the same village. For many years schoolfellows. Oh, times had changed, poor girl. She must take that wretch Sir Sandy to her arms. Well, Smith," continued the fair wanton in a soft whisper, "I don't envy her." The lady's speech had given Smith time to recover himself. He now clearly saw that Miss Maudley knew the character of his companion, but he forced away thought, and filled a tumbler with champagne, and constrained himself to take Miss Chervil's willing hand, and with a bombastical compliment tossed it off at a draught. The liberal bumpers which he drank had their desired effect. He soon lost all remembrance of his duty, and willingly yielded to the arguments of Lord Carmine that there was no necessity for him to depart that evening. His fair friend also hinted to him that she had taken a small villa a few miles from town, and if she might hope for his company, she would easily get rid of the Marquis, who, at present, was dangling after her. Our youth willingly consented. He was in no humour to object to anything. Reflection was gone, and he acted and spoke at the will of as the will of the moment dictated to him. At 3 they left the gardens. Lord Carmine promised to see Smith in the morning and take his breakfast at Mrs. Chervil's. The morning awoke our hero to all the horrors of remorse. The first ideas were to fly without the loss of another moment. He jumped up in the bed, and the fair siren threw her arms around him, and her entreaties and blandishments soon prevailed upon him to wait till Lord Carmine should come. The name of Lord Carmine roused up another hydra. Recollection suddenly flashed upon his mind, and he smote his head with violence when he remembered the £2,000 and the improbability of paying it. The kind attention of his fascinating hostess by degrees dispersed for a while these melancholy ideas. She laughed at his ridiculous complaints, as she called them, told him like a philosopher that good and evil came by turns, and that we ought to enjoy the one and despise the other. His heart, which was open to anything but the plain truth, eagerly embraced the deception. He caught her in his arms, swore she argued like an angel, and called himself 1,000 fools for giving way to his melancholy. About 1 o'clock, Lord Carmine came. He was surprised to see Smith in such good spirits. Our hero talked indeed that he must hasten after his regiment, but affected to speak carelessly on the business, as if it was a thing of very little consequence. "I see," said Lord Carmine. "No necessity of your going today. It is improbable to suppose that the troops will be on board the moment they arrive. And besides, it's 10 times more unlikely they should sail directly. You have already stayed beyond your time, and being absent without leave, some excuse must be made. It will do as well for a week as a day." A debate ensued concerning what excuse to make. Smith for a long time opposed anything like falsity, but as there was no possibility of making a true one, he yielded to the plausible though deceitful arguments of his friends, and agreed to say the breaking down of a carriage and a hurt he received on that account had delayed him. Lord Carmine's having been broke and delayed them at Mrs. Lurie's gave the excuse, and his lordship, without the least regard to truth, wrote a letter to that purpose for Smith to carry with him. It may seem strange that a young man of real good principles and honour, as Smith certainly was, should consent to a wilful violation of the truth, but we must consider the increasing force of vice by which he was now so artfully assailed, and how one crime imperceptibly leads on to another. The day before he would have scorned such an action. Now, distressed in his mind, seduced by the arguments of an insinuating female and an unprincipled man, he trusted not to his own reason, but, like a noble beast entangled in the toils, he followed where his leaders thought proper to conduct him. I shall not plague my readers by an attempt to analyse the various contending sensations that floated in his mind. The occurrences of the preceding day and evening were no longer concealed. The repetition of his folly, and again yielding to the allurement of play, the want of proper resolution to return back to his regiment, his infatuated love of dissipation, he clearly saw it all, but could not dwell upon it for a moment. But when the idea of Miss Maudley crossed his mind, the consciousness of the light in which he must appear to her was a dagger in his heart. The loss of her favour seemed to make all other misfortunes trivial, and blunted his feelings to those which more immediately affected him. Fain would he have drowned his cares in a wilful forgetfulness, but here the will always prevents the act. Dreading then the thoughts of following his regiment, for there he should meet with no tempting society to drive away reflection, he determined, whatever was the consequence, to stay a day or two longer. The amusements for the evening were already planned out by Mrs. Sherville and Lord Carmine. It may be asked what object they had by detaining him from his regiment. Simply, none. Lord Carmine had found a very sensible and pleasant companion, and the lady was ever partial to him. As for the consequences of his staying, that they were careless of. It could not affect them in the remotest degree, and Lord Carmine laughed in his own mind at the idea of his getting into some unpleasant circumstances through his easy credulity. Immersed in a sea of dissipation, our youth had not resolution enough to break his way through, and he hurried away 2 days more without allowing himself a moment's reflection. On the third morning he prepared to go to P. His kind friend would have detained him, and when he did depart, he promised, if possible, to return in a few days, so much did he dread to be alone, so infatuated was he to a life of dissipation, so little did he think of the evil behind him. Arrived at P, he heard, to his utmost confusion, that the ships with the regiment had sailed 48 hours before. Like a man who has received a sudden stroke from a thundercloud, said our hero. His faculties were benumbed, but when the blood began to flow, passion and anger against himself and late associates gave themselves vent. Not otherwise than a madman did he bite his lips and stamp upon the ground. Then, taking out the letter he had received from Lord Carmine, "Thou cursed companion of lies! Thus I serve thee, as I wished from my soul I could serve thy author." So saying, he tore it to atoms and trampled it into the dust. This violence was but of short duration. It soon gave place to a seeming kind of thought, and he hastened to inquire if it were yet possible to overtake them. None of the boatmen gave him any hopes, nor were they willing to attempt it. Some at last agreed for 20 guineas to try what might be done, but here was another difficulty, for he had only 5 guineas remaining. His baggage was gone with the troop, and after trying about the town, he found he could only raise 5 more for his watch and other trifles. By this time the evening began to set in. The sky lowered, a drizzling rain came on, which soon settled in a mist, and the boatmen informed him that on no terms now would they offer to put to sea. The situation of the young man was, at this, most pitiable in the greatest degree. He saw no means whatever of overtaking his regiment, but he determined to stay at P till the morrow. He had before purposed to have applied to the bankers of the place for the loan of 20 guineas, but the mist, which was become general, rendered his intention totally useless. For the first time in his life he passed a miserable night without an hour of sleep. If he had before banished thought, it returned upon him tenfold as he lay restless on his bed, and brought with it a long unfinished series of horrors. He got up as soon as it was light, tired and unrefreshed, awake to the multiplied evils he had heaped upon himself. The morn was fine, and he hastened to the seaside, but alas! The wind had changed, and the boatmen refused the trial even if he would double the sum. And besides, they informed him that the wind had been so favourable for the fleet that it would be impossible to overtake it. In vain Smith urged them. They believed him little better than a madman, and positively refused. In truth, he could scarcely be said to be in his right senses. All the day, without rest, food, or intermission, Did he busy himself in making inquiries if it were possible by any means to overtake the fleet? Fatigued, distressed, and disappointed, he returned in the evening to his inn. The second night was passed with a small portion of sleep indeed, but that, broken and confused, increased the disturbance of his soul, and the morning returned upon him with all its horrors. In this wretched state of mind, the unhappy youth prepared to return to town. How to proceed, in what manner to act, he was quite at a loss. Where he was, it was needless to remain, and to attempt an arrangement of his affairs seemed to call him to London. Accordingly, he took a place in the first coach that was going to the metropolis. On the road, he found full leisure for reflection, in defiance of the questions, cavils, and explanations of his fellow travellers. But every thought was pregnant with horror. Every reflection was a dagger to his soul. Those religious principles which had early been nourished in his mind now alone supported him, but the rank weeds of dissipation had greatly weakened their strength, their growth. Though hope had almost forsaken him, yet a kind of constrained fortitude supplied its place. But this grew weaker and weaker each moment. One while he listened with an eager attention to the remarks of the company and the coach. Again, the horrors of his situation, like the stone of Sisyphus, returned upon him with redoubled violence after each ineffectual struggle. At last, finding the exertion in vain, he determined coolly to review the melancholy prospect before him. His Oxford debts he soon passed over, trusting that here he might for once trespass on the kindness of his friends, alas, whom he almost doubted if he retained. The London ones were more considerable, but time and economy he relied upon to pay them. The more formidable debts of honour struck him still deeper. But when he found that very honour on which he had so long trusted, his fame, his character gone, he shuddered at the thought. There is not a greater bugbear than what we call honour. It bears a more tempting outside than even virtue herself, but it is a seducing and faithless mistress that under the specious pretence of love leads you blindfold to your ruin. On this our poor youth had rested, this was his last support, and this had now forsaken him. No relief from certain poverty and disgrace remained. The world attacking him, his conscience accusing him, his friends forsaking him, or, what is still worse, ruined and involved by his means, he could no longer reflect upon the subject. As soon as he entered the streets of London, he hastily leapt from the coach, and throwing a trifle to the driver, rushed with a kind of instinct to his old lodgings, near the Hummums. No one was at home. His Oxford friends he knew had left town. He hurried into the coffee-room, and taking up the first paper that offered, began reading, almost devoid of thought. But too soon a paragraph caught his attention, which, as he greedily devoured it, all hope, even the appearance of fortitude, forsook him. "Oh, wretch!" cried he, hastily striking his forehead. Then, with a desperate calmness, walked out of the room. The paragraph which had so greatly affected him was to the following purpose. This morning was married by the Right Reverend the Lord Bishop of Sir Sandy Simeon Swain, Baronet, to Miss Modeley, only daughter of James Modeley, Esquire. Chapter 3, Epigraph. Avaunt despair, eternal wisdom deals, or peace to man, or minstrel, for his good, alike designed, and shall the creature say, why hast thou done this, and with impious pride destroy the life God gave? Joan of Arc. Apologies, one of the words is obscured. In the midst of all the evils our imprudent youth had brought upon himself, the distant hope that a possibility might happen to make him clear in the world and worthy the notice of the only woman whom he had ever truly loved, had still supported him. The prisoner confined in the clay-cold dungeon, loaded with chains and dragging on a wretched life by the fixed allowance of plain bread and water, sees with some pleasure the glimmering light that breaks through the ironed crevice of his cell. So this poor young man fondly dwelt on that one light, that his adored Eliza might at last be his. But the rude hand of fate had now extinguished every cheering ray, and gloomy darkness spread itself over his whole soul. The violent agitation of the foregoing week, the restless days and nights he had lately spent, had harassed and weakened his manly frame. The raging conflict in his mind irritated his nerves, already fatigued and relaxed, and a slow fever preyed on his spirits and undermined his strength. Sick in body and in mind, his native energy failed him. The gathering storms poured upon him. No friendly port was open to receive him, and the anchor of hope was lost. When Smith returned to his old lodgings, he found the door open, and as he walked up the stairs, calmly said to the landlady, "I can have the same rooms for a few days?" Civilly, she answered him in the affirmative, and entering his room, he threw himself upon the sofa. "Now then," said he, "every possibility of happiness, every hope, nay, every wish, I may almost say, of extricating myself from the difficulties around me have quite forsaken me. Can any circumstance in the course of things possibly happen that I may be able to pass the wretched remains of my life, even in silent poverty and contempt? No, a jail each moment awaits me. That I could bear, my liberty I could resign and live, but the loss of my honour, that good name, the comfort of the poorest fellow on the face of the earth, the irretrievable ruin of my character with slavery, poverty, and disgrace, who can sustain? But were it possible, I could be again restored to the world and throw off these chains both of the mind and body. Were my honour retrieved, were my debts paid, would life then be desirable? Should I even care for it? When the only person with whom I can wish to participate it is torn from me forever. Farewell, then, vain world. For what purpose am I to drag on a miserable existence? No means are left by which I can be extricated. My life will be but a disgrace to my former friends, a burden to myself, and surely in such a case I may resign it. But let me not rashly fly from my trust before I have settled, as far as I am able, my distracted affairs, and removed every trouble and care from others which must follow, were I to leave it unprepared." Thus, desperately and deliberately resigning himself to destruction, did this young man find some consolation and even defence for his crime, because he purposed to prevent the disagreeable consequences that might attend a hasty death. So alike is every picture of vice, that there is no wretch on the face of the globe, however infamous and wicked, but will attempt to excuse and gloss over his crimes by some plausible pretence or other. The thief, the midnight plunderer, and the more petty villains of society glory in their cunning and dexterity, while the gloomy murderer who stabs without a sigh will daub his infamy by the names of courage and resolution. Alas, there is no crime, however heinous, but will find a protector and defender. In like manner did this miserable young man soften to himself the soul-harrowing deed of self-murder, and even by deliberate thought resolved upon suicide. Accordingly, he first prepared to write a full and clear account of his wretched state to Mr. Freeman, of his fixed determination, which long before he received the melancholy news would be completed. The following words concluded his dreadful letter: "You have now, sir, heard the evils which overwhelm me, evils never to be conquered but by death. This necessity forces upon me, and like the unhappy malefactor who publicly suffers on the scaffold that his crimes may no longer affect mankind, so ought I, by the same law of justice, to give up that life, which only increases the misery of everyone connected with me. A life of misery I could bear myself, did it not spread its baneful influence around, while the depraved, the infamous, horrors, cowardly Smith lives. Who can notice him unless by embracing similar ruin to his own? But when he is no more, his friends and acquaintance cannot be involved in his crimes, and perhaps mankind may pity and forgive him. Tomorrow evening your ungrateful friend will be no more. A pistol will precipitate him from bridge, and that the body may not be found to bring disgrace on the innocent, leaden weights will hide it, I trust for ever, in the water beneath. Dear sir, farewell. Dare I say, God bless you? Oh, may your virtues bear you aloft above that despair into which my crimes have hurled me." When he had finished his letter to Mr. Freeman, he found himself rather more at ease, but soon the recollection of the days of his youth at the castle of St. Donat's returned, where, innocent and free from guilt, he had listened to the friendly instructions of Mr. Freeman, and had resolved that to imitate his amiable character should be the study of his future life. How indeed had he failed? How widely different the course that he had taken! From such thoughts, at first pleasing, the sweets were soon gone, and the gall alone remained. Despair returned with double force. Upon death alone could he think with any satisfaction. Upon death he had determined. One more night, and all his worldly cares were ended. In the morning of the morrow he proposed as far as possible to arrange his affairs. In the evening the scene would be finally closed. He took up his hat and went out to deposit in the post office the letter he had written to Mr. Freeman. But when he arrived at the General Post Office, he found the letter-box was shut up. He was going away when a gentleman who was one of the clerks opened the cider, very civilly told him it was not yet too late, and took it from him. As if released from a burden, Smith hastily walked away. The gentleman called after him, but he was too much lost in himself to hear the call. He next went to a pawnbroker's and pledged his watch for 2 guineas. With these he furnished himself with a pistol, powder and lead. Wishing to be as collected as possible on the following day, and conscious that without aid he should not be able to take any rest that night, he called an apothecary's and ordered a soporific draught. This he took before he went to bed. Nature, exhausted by the occurrences of the last 3 days, embraced with pleasure this temporary oblivion, and the youth for a few hours forgot both his sorrows and the fatal termination that awaited him. He arose in the morning somewhat indeed refreshed in the body, but the hellish purpose of the evening as firmly rooted as ever in his mind. After taking a slight breakfast, the last meal he had resolved to make, he began the intended arrangement of his affairs. Alas, he had but little to arrange, but the plausible act was an object to employ his mind till the evening, and to amuse his conscience with the false idea that he had neither rashly nor carelessly forsaken his post. He first drew up a systematical account of his debts in Oxford and in town, and closed with a vast sum lost to Lord Carmine. About to leave this world, the poor youth regarded things with another eye, and no longer considered his last debt as the most honourable and first to be paid. In a note addressed to Mr. Freeman, he pointed out to him the debts he wished to be satisfied if his friends would so far respect his memory as to trouble themselves any longer for him. The sums he mentioned did not amount to £100. These were necessary articles, and his baggage on board the vessel, if it could be retrieved, amounted to about that sum. The other debts had been the offsprings of luxury and dissipation, and as such he naturally regarded them as of far less consequence. These came to about £400, but he mentioned them that in case his birth ever became known, and the means of paying them made easy, there might be no mistake. Lastly, he sealed up the packet addressed to Mr. Freeman, and telling the people of the house that he was about to begin a long journey that evening, desired them to give it as directed, whenever it should be called for. With a deep groan, he took from his bosom the trinket which Miss Mowbray had once given him, and the ivory cross that had been his mother's. "Beloved memorial of those most dear to me," said he, "I must now part with you. Left, if this wretched body should ever be found, you prove the means of discovering its owner. No, it matters not who will ever value you, who will ever know your worth when I am gone. Pledges of a mother and of a—" His voice failed him. "He shall grace my funeral." The death-doomed period began to approach. To the silent hour of midnight he looked forward for the perpetration of the ghastly deed as the least liable to interruption. On the close of the evening he walked out to review the fatal spot, and so to arrange the horrid work that no prevention might take place. My heart yearned while I traced this miserable young man through the deliberate series of his destruction. When I consider the excellent qualities of his heart, the liberal endowments of his mind, the nobleness of his soul, all contaminated by the deadly blasts of dissipation. Why should I enumerate the evident causes of thy destruction? A want of decent resolution in virtue, a too great fondness of the applause of others. O cursed vanity! Thy temptations were not greater than what falls to the lot of most young men. Why hadst thou not power to resist? What are abilities? What is learning? What is sense? Blessings given us by the deity. Man misapplies and abuses them and makes a curse of the blessing. What opening prospects dawned in the early morn of his life? Before the hour of noon, how was the scene changed? That his situation was now deplorable, no one can deny. He had contracted debts, both of real and nominal honour, to an amount he had no possibility of paying. His sole means he had lately forfeited. How forfeited? There was the sting. Endowed with natural valour and the highest sense of its duties, he had acted the part of a public coward and forsaken his post. And if anything was wanting to complete the blow, he had forever lost the first and warmest wish of his heart. "The days of my life," said he, "have been days of misery. Were they to continue any longer, what a prospect! Is there no hope remaining? Not one. Disgrace in every form awaits me. My peace and happiness are already lost. A trial, condemnation, and punishment are preparing to follow. My present fame is gone, my future blasted. My friends forsake or perish with me. My creditors seize on me. A jail shall not terminate the scene." And he rushed furiously out of the house. Rash and unthinking young man, rush not into the deadly gulf of suicide. Beware a crime never to be expiated, never to be repented of, a crime that stands alone in the human catalogue, a crime that eternally closes the fair prospects of hope, and leaves thee in a wild, solitary, and impenetrable gloom. Gracious God, into whatever troubles I may fall by my vices or my misfortunes, let me not despair of thy forgiveness. To thee belongs justice and vengeance. To thee belongs mercy. Shall wretched man dare to be his own judge, to punish or to pardon? Shall he presume to deal the bolts of the Almighty? O God, I am dependent on thee alone. Let fiat I came into this world, I wait thy call ere I leave it. Thou hast appointed me a station here. Let me fulfill its dictates. Let me not fly from my trust, but let me resolutely bear its burdens. It is enough for me that it is thy pleasure. Thy will be done. Chapter 4, Epigraph. Poor broken glass, I often did behold in thy sweet semblance my old age, new born. But now that fair fresh mirror, dim and cold, shows me a bare-boned death by time outworn. Oh, from my cheeks my image thou hast torn, and shivered all the beauty from my glass, that I no more can see what once I was. Shakespeare's Tarquin and Lucretia. To investigate the particulars of this ungrateful tale, we must go back to the circumstance of the letter which was sent to Mr. Freeman. It may be remembered that the gentleman who took the letter from poor Smith called to him to come back, and that the other, wrapped up in his own melancholy ideas, heard him not, but hurried away from the spot. The clerk of the post office who thus called to him knew Mr. Freeman very well, and seeing the letter was directed to him, wished to inform the youth that Mr. Freeman was, at that very time, in town. As Smith heard not his voice, the clerk did not put the letter in the box with the rest, but at his own peril kept it to give to Mr. Freeman, whom he was to see in the morning. Mr. Freeman was to dine in the city, and it was nearly dinner time before he called at the post office. The gentleman gave him the letter, adding that a person had brought it there the other night, in a violent hurry, and was gone again before he could inform him he was in town. The evening already began to set in. Mr. Freeman therefore waited till he came to his friend's house before he opened the letter. With the utmost horror he read the first line: "Before you receive this, the unhappy writer will be no more." He cast his eye on the signature. He hastily seized upon his hat. Again he stopped, and opening the letter, he eagerly looked from whence it was dated, then flew down the stairs and rushed impetuously out of the house. To the inquiries of his astonished friend, "It is a business of the utmost consequence," he said. In a moment he was in the street, and running along the pavement, ceased not till he arrived at the lodgings of the youth. "Which is Mr. Smith's room?" cried he, and the people of the house showed him to the door, and he rushed into the apartment. Smith was not in the room. Mr. Freeman turned round and was again rushing out, when he bethought him of the letter. He called for a candle and immediately read it over, in hopes by the contents that the horrid deed was not yet accomplished. Uncertain from which bridge the crime was to be perpetrated, and finding the hour was to be 12 at night, he determined for a while to stay where he was. Exhausted and out of breath, he threw himself upon a sofa. Scarcely was he seated before footsteps were heard, slowly coming up the stairs. Mr. Freeman, with trembling anxiety, rose from his seat. The door opened, and Smith entered. Suddenly and violently Mr. Freeman caught him in his arms, but he could do no more. His swollen heart rose to his mouth and stopped all utterance. Overcome with the contending passions within him, he sunk upon the sofa and burst into a violent paroxysm of tears. Smith at first stood as one thunderstruck. Yet it seemed to him as if an angel had descended from heaven and snatched him from destruction. But his thoughts were soon turned from himself to the situation of Mr. Freeman, whose tears, bursting with a fury that baffles all description, strongly showed the dreadful agitation of his mind. Smith, alarmed, approached him and attempted to speak, but Mr. Freeman pushed him violently from him. Then again, suddenly rising, he seized him by the arm, and his whole frame trembling at the time, he hastily searched the pockets of the youth. What he looked for was not there. He rushed to the table, which was a small deal one, and had a drawer locked. "This is no time for locks," said he, and furiously tearing the table to pieces, found the pistol which he was looking for. It was not yet loaded, but Mr. Freeman, without regarding that circumstance, attempted again and again to discharge it through the window. But finding upon repeated trials it did not go off, he opened the sash and threw it with all his force into an adjacent court. Then turning to Smith, "Wretched boy," said he, "you never yet told me a falsehood. Have you any more of these infernal instruments?" Smith meekly answered, "No." Mr. Freeman, as if released from a heavy weight, heaved a deep sigh and sunk again upon the sofa. Smith was very much affected at the agitation of his friend, who now seemed somewhat more composed, and he offered again to speak to him and to take his hand. Mr. Freeman did not refuse his hand, but strongly grasping Smith, said, "Promise me sacredly you will not again attempt your life." As Smith hesitated for words, he emphatically continued, "If you have the courage of the mind as well as of the body, if you have the real fortitude, the fortitude to bear and conquer and not to fly from or yield to trouble and affliction, if you have any regard for me, for Gray, for Willis, for the peace of mind of any of your friends, if you wish them not to curse your memory, to execrate the hour when they first knew you, if the name of the Almighty God has still respect in your heart, and you doubt not his mercy and the merits of his beloved Son, answer me at once, that your life shall be safe from self-assassination." "Forgive me, dear sir," said Smith, while grief for the situation to which he had driven his friend almost choked his utterance. "I will indeed be ruled by you. Whatever and how dreadful soever the fate that awaits me may be, I will patiently bear it to the end of my pilgrimage. And though my crimes and misfortunes are many, self-murder shall not close the list." "Then, Smith," said Mr. Freeman, greatly softened, "thou shalt still be dear to me. Thou art no longer the complete wretch I a few moments ago thought thee. All may yet be well." Smith shook his head at the last words. The idea of his still beloved, though no longer Miss Maudley, was foremost in his mind. "Oh, Mr. Freeman," said he, "how shall I ever thank you for your most timely rescue? May my God forgive me as well as you." Other thoughts than suicide now took possession of his soul, and he walked into the adjoining room. As he closed the door, Mr. Freeman felt that in his present agitation he could not leave him, and gently opening it, he perceived at the further corner of the room the penitent youth upon his knees in the act of devotion. Released from every fear, unperceived, he again retreated, and Smith soon after returned to his friend. The alarming perturbation that raged through Mr. Freeman's whole frame had more effect upon the young man than all the remonstrances and solid reasonings of a set of philosophers could have accomplished at the time. Mr. Freeman was a man of very strong passions. He had constantly accustomed himself to rein them within due bounds, and very rarely it was that they exceeded their limits. But the dreadful circumstance that had just been presented to his mind had thrown him completely off his guard. Subject to control, they raged with a redoubled violence, and, but for the seasonable intervention of tears, might have been dangerous in their consequences. While the fate of Smith was in doubt, fear smothered them. But when once Mr. Freeman was certain he was safe, his anger at the intention, his joy for his safety, hope, mistrust, and 1,000 nameless suspicions all burst forth and occasioned those violent sensations I have faintly endeavoured to describe. Mr. Freeman was so well assured of Smith's adherence to the truth, so solemnly given, that he had no longer any apprehensions concerning his destroying himself. But as he did not choose to leave the youth in his present ungrateful circumstances, he sent for his portmanteau and got accommodated with a bed in the same house. Mr. Freeman in the meantime explained to Smith his unexpected arrival and the lucky circumstance of his getting his letter from one of the clerks. Everything being duly explained, and as neither of the gentlemen had eaten anything since the morning, a dinner was ordered from the nearest coffee-house. In the course of the evening, Smith recounted the particulars of his ill fate, nor did he conceal the soul-rending news that the beloved idol of his heart was now in the arms of another. I omit a very excellent discourse which Mr. Freeman made, to show the cursed evils of suicide. This day, my dear friend, concluded he, I shall reckon the happiest of my life in having prevented the very worst of crimes, a crime that cannot be atoned for, a crime of all others the most selfish. The false philosophy of atheism encouraged it, pride applauded, and shame gave the blow. Did Brutus, Cassius, and Cato murder themselves to benefit mankind? Had they dared to live, chance might at last have favoured them. But they fainted in the cause, and their deaths only sealed the destruction of their country. Men of real virtue disdain to die through fear. Regulus, but I've done. O Smith, thou hast happily conquered. Be henceforth virtuous, be truly brave. Only the world itself perish around thee, uninjured thou shalt still be free. In the interim of the few days that Smith had been absent from town to Port P, a particular circumstance had already taken place, which, as it is connected with the thread of my story, I shall relate in the next chapter. Chapter 5, Epigraph. The man who wrongs my friend to the earth's utmost verge I would pursue. No place that e'er so wholly should protect him, no shape that artful fear e'er formed should hide him, till he fair answer made and did me justice. Rose Fair Penitent. After our hero's departure to P, Lord Carmine, in the course of conversation with Mrs. Sherville, discovered that Mr. Marmaduke's description of the finances of his friend had been, at least, greatly exaggerated. His lordship was not at all pleased at the intelligence, fearful that he had taken great pains to very little purpose, but determined to make more particular inquiries. The reader will scarcely recollect a wretch of the name of Wireman at Oxford with our hero, and who was ever pushing himself into the company of the great. But Lord Carmine met him the same morning in the park, and had occasionally seen him before. Wireman bowed very low. Here, said his lordship, calling after him, Mr. Wireman, I think your name is. Oh, yes, my lord, at your service. You were at Oxford, I believe. Do you remember a person of the name of Smith, of C.C.? Smith, my lord, of a damned old castle in Wales. Mr. Wireman got his cue, and in his eagerness to deprecate our hero was as far on the other side of the mark as ever Marmaduke had been. I believe, Mr. What's-your-name, said his lordship as he left him, you are not very correct, but I find I have been damnably taken in anyhow. It happened the evening after that Lord Carmine accidentally fell into the company with Lord Edward Caffisip, and as he knew the Duke frequently resided in Glamorganshire, and that his son was lately come from Oxford, he inquired if he knew such a person as Smith of C.C., describing his person. Lord Edward answered, Oh, very well. He lives near me in Wales. And is he a man of great expectations? Not the least, my lord. He has been very unlucky lately, but he is... Well, I believe a perfect swindler, answered Lord Carmine with the utmost contempt. Lord Edward fired. A swindler, my lord? At least, added the other indignantly, I'm sure he's an adventurer, or he never would have played with me for thousands when he's not worth a shilling. Adventurer? For thousands? I never knew he gamed. Yes, he owes me at present 2,000 guineas. Oh, he does, continued Lord Edward with a sneer. I believe I can tell who is the greatest adventurer. Sir, said Lord Carmine haughtily, as if asking a question. Yes, retorted Lord Edward, no longer able to curb his passion. I mean you. The angry lords would have immediately put in practice the pugilistic art in which Lord Carmine was an adept, but respect for the company interposed, and Lord Edward departed soon after. He was not surprised next morning by being waited upon by Major O'Hazy, who very politely delivered the following message, that Lord Carmine requested the honour of his company at between 12 and 1 that morning, accompanied by a friend and a surgeon if his lordship thought proper. Lord Edward answered, he would not fail at attending him, and should only bring a friend. Between 12 and 1 the gentlemen met. Lord Carmine fired first. The ball struck Lord Edward on the forehead, and he fell by the force of the blow. He had stood fronting his adversary with his head erected, and luckily the ball hit him so high that it only grazed his forehead and passed away. To the surprise of Lord Carmine, he instantly rose from the ground, and professing himself uninjured, the surgeon tied a white handkerchief round his head to stop the blood which flowed down his face. His second now gave Lord Edward his pistol, who discharged it at random, but the ball lodged in the body of his adversary. The surgeon again stepped forward. He examined the wound. The ball had entered too deep to be extracted on the spot, and Lord Carmine was carried in great pain to his carriage. As Lord Edward was leaving the field, Captain O'Hazy came up to him and informed him, in defence of his friend, that walking with Lord Carmine in the park, they had met a fellow of the name of Wireman, who had in a great degree occasioned the quarrel. Unluckily for Wireman, Lord Edward in his way home perceived him at a small distance. Wireman was familiarly coming up to him when his lordship, dismounting from his horse, in a few words told him the fatal consequences of his conduct. "Etch, do you think you shall escape?" "No, I will make an example of you for the lying chatterers of the day." He was as good as his word, for he exercised his whip upon his back and shoulders till he had completely demolished a fine silken coat with which Wireman, newly equipped, was proceeding on a visit to an honourable acquaintance. The tattered poltroon returned back to town, and shame held his tongue upon the circumstance. The surgeon on the following day attended Lord Edward by his particular desire, and informed him that his patient was extremely ill. They had not been able yet to extract the ball, and that he had great fears for his life. Lord Edward was extremely sorry to hear this unfavourable account, but as he considered himself in no respect as the aggressor, he determined not to fly his country. On the third morning, the day after Mr. Freeman had so happily prevented the desperate intention of our hero, the ball was extracted. But Lord Carmine was become so weak by the exertion that the low diet to which he was confined and the great pain he suffered had wonderfully depressed his haughty spirits. He began seriously to think he should die, and conscience, who had never troubled his lordship before, began to exert his influence. He had known before Smith left London that the fleet had sailed, and supposing that he might have returned, he made inquiries at the coffee-house which Smith had said he frequented, and found he had ordered dinner from thence the day before, and lodged in Covent Garden. Lord Carmine lost no time in summoning his confidential valet and ordering everyone else out of the room. He then dictated the following letter. To Smith, Esquire. Sir, I enclose your 32 guineas as well as your note for 2,000, none of which you fairly lost. I trust to your honour that whether I recover or not, you will never make this circumstance public. C. There was another paper in which was the following. My quarrel and subsequent duel with Lord Edward Cassiusin originate with myself. I make this acknowledgment as a man of honour and as a gentleman, to save his lordship any trouble in case of my death. Carmine. Smith received the papers while he was at breakfast with Mr. Freeman. As he could implicitly trust that gentleman, he made no scruple of showing them both to him, and as he gave the first, a smile once more brightened the countenance of the youth. When Smith had thought of departing from this sublunary sphere, his debts of honour had appeared of the smallest moment, but at present things were changed, and he was not sorry to be released from so heavy a sum. Such a strong hold has fastidious custom upon the mind. As the drowning wretch catches at the small straw in hopes to save him, as the miser laments the most trifling loss from his heaped-up treasures, as the fair damsel with myriads of admirers misses even the most insignificant eloper from her train, as the rustic milkmaid, dressed for the fair, admires her last new ribbon more than all her other finery, as the poor patient, when the doctor almost despairs, embraces with rapture the most trifling symptom of returning health, regardless of the numerous ills which still oppress him, so did this one circumstance exhilarate the mind of our hero, though undoubtedly the least to be regarded from the ills that surrounded him. The second letter concerning Lord Edward and a duel next engaged their attention, and Mr. Freeman and Smith agreed to call at the Duke's. They found Lord Edward at home and very glad to see them, though much surprised at Smith's being still in England. To their friendly inquiries, they found the wound in his forehead was trifling, but that the ball had passed twice through his hat. We but this morning, said Smith, knew of your affair with Lord Carmine. I'm happy to give you this, producing the paper, which told us of it, though I cannot help being surprised that my Lord Carmine sent it to me. Lord Edward took the paper, and was not displeased to read it. For through his own mind acquitted him, for he was very glad of this public testimony to crush the malevolence of the world. I trust, said his lordship, giving the paper to Mr. Freeman, I shall have no occasion to use it, and that you, sir, as I suppose Smith will soon follow his regiment, will be so good as to take care of it if unhappily Lord Carmine should not recover. Then turning to Smith, he added, his lordship thought proper the other day, from the information of Wireman, to abuse you and insult me at the same time. This was the occasion of the quarrel with his lordship, and accounts for sending you the paper. Wireman I fortunately met with the same day, and gave him the discipline of my whip. Smith and Mr. Freeman saw at once the delicacy of his lord's explanation, and forbore asking him the particulars. Our hero warmly thanked him for his friendship, which he told him had been of the utmost service to him. At this moment, Lord Carmine's surgeon, who was also Lord Edward's, was announced. He informed them that the ball was extracted the other night, and that though he was very weak, he had the greatest hopes of his recovery. When the surgeon retired, Mr. Freeman accompanied him, and left the two young heroes together. Mr. Freeman learnt the particulars of the quarrel from the surgeon, and then sent up his name to the Duke. He found his Grace in his study, who with his usual politeness received him. Mr. Freeman, having duly returned his compliments, said, "Your Grace has frequently offered me your assistance. May I beg leave to ask a particular favour of you?" His Grace, a little alarmed, replied, "Well, that I should be extremely happy to serve him if it lay in his power, but—" "Well, I beg your Grace's pardon for interrupting you. It is to write a recommendatory letter for a young friend of mine, who has also the honour of being known to your Grace." The Duke, greatly relieved from the fears his petitioner had raised, replied with a smile, "Oh, with the utmost pleasure. I'm sure I can, with the utmost propriety, write in favour of any friend of Mr. Freeman's." Mr. Freeman bowed low, and informed him of Smith's unpleasant situation as to his regiment. "If your Grace will interest yourself with the Commander-in-Chief, or with any others in authority whom your Grace thinks most proper, and explains this unlucky affair, I have the greatest hopes that the young man may be permitted to join his regiment, and be reinstated in his original situation, with only a slight reprimand." Mr. Freeman accordingly explained the whole affair, without mentioning Lord Carmine or Smith's intrigue with Mrs. Sherville. The Duke was glad of the opportunity to oblige a man whom he really esteemed, and with a hearty goodwill promised to interest himself in the business. His Grace every day experienced the obligation he was under to Mr. Freeman for the reformation of his son Edward, who from a wild ungovernable youth was become most dutiful and obedient. His son's conduct too in the affair of the duel had won his Grace's heart, for though the Duke had been brought up delicately, had led a courtly life, and like Falstaff was too fond of the good things of this world to be ambitious of the character of a Hotspur, yet he was extremely well pleased to find that the family carriage still remained in its full glory in his youngest son Edward. When his friends and connections called upon the account of his son's wound, which soon became public, the old Duke felt himself flattered. It was as another honorary quartering added to his coat of arms, and the praise that was bestowed upon his son was an aggrandizement to his house. His eldest son, the Marquis of Derry, had been many years in Italy. That voluptuous climate suited the debauched young nobleman. He was possessed of a handsome fortune independent of his father, and a Roman courtesan consumed it at her pleasure. The Marquis was of a weak and sickly constitution, and his mistress too well knew her situation to suffer him to leave the country. Under the pretence of his health, she still sought the means of detaining him, and though his father had repeatedly written, and he himself had offered to take her with him, she thought her station much more eligible and sure where she remained at present. It is no wonder, then, in this situation of his Grace's family, that he considered Lord Edward as the chief prop and stay of it. His Grace had entirely adopted Mr. Freeman's plan concerning Miss Mary Rozier, by which generous conduct he had ensured the gratitude and obedience of his son, and the esteem and respect of the young lady. Lord Edward still persisted in his attachment, and so highly was his Grace pleased with every other part of his conduct, that his consent to the match became more and more probable. Mr. Freeman informed Smith of his audience with his Grace, which, with the warm friendship testified by Lord Edward, greatly revived him. But ever when a temporary joy was about to gladden his heart, the recollection that his beloved Eliza was no more to him at once sunk him to the earth. Lord Carmine, a few days after, was declared out of danger, and Lord Edward was sufficiently recovered to go abroad as usual. Mr. Freeman intended to remain with our hero till a vessel that carried dispatches from the government to the late equipment sailed, in which Smith was to go with letters from the Duke and others to palliate and excuse his neglect. His friends, Freeman and Lord Edward, were with him continually, and they could not help remarking the melancholy that had seized him. Mr. Freeman greatly feared for his health, and was anxious for his leaving England as soon as possible, in hopes that the change of scene might raise up new ideas and cure the preying grief. A circumstance that occurred the day before he left town strongly showed how deeply his loss was rooted in his heart. As they were returning home to dinner, and were passing the door of a linen draper, an elegant carriage drew up, and as the gentleman stopped to permit some ladies to get in, the lovely cause of his sorrows came from the shop, and with another lady was handed to the carriage by a stranger. Our hero saw and sickened at the sight, He leaned against the wall, and Mr. Freeman caught him by the arm lest he should fall to the ground, and the chariot drove away. Smith quickly raised himself, and forcing a vigour into his frame which his mind did not feel, he hastily walked on. Not a word passed, but Mr. Freeman determined next morning to set off for P, and as everything was ready, they accordingly departed very early. They waited at P 2 days for the sailing of the vessel, when Mr. Freeman, with a studied calmness, though his heart was wrung at the time, took leave of his young friend. Mr. Freeman had taken care to furnish our hero with a few excellent military books, which he particularly recommended to him to study. Mr. Freeman very properly considered that he would want some employment to amuse his mind while he remained at sea. Smith, who dreaded reflection, eagerly accepted the gift, and the study of the charts, maps, plans, and drawings agreeably amused his time, while the nice calculations and mathematical demonstrations were continual food to a searching mind. A mind like Smith's, which had before studied with avidity the clear doctrines of wisdom, in the truth, explaining problems of Euclid. Mr. Freeman himself was an excellent mathematician, and they whose studies have led them the same way need not be told the forcible hold it has upon the mind. As such, Mr. Freeman had early instructed Smith in a knowledge of figures, a knowledge that he had employed to advantage many an idle hour of his life. Our hero was so pleased and occupied by his books that he associated very little with anyone on board the vessel. But his health returned, and his grief gradually settled in a grave and silent melancholy. Chapter 6. Epigraph. He to the terrors of the ocean known, in labour versed, in danger fearless grown, met death in all her shapes, but dreaded her in none. Blackmore's Eliza. The captain of the vessel was an odd character, and our hero had very little idea of his bravery if ever it were called into action. He was a man who, though not uncivil, was very far from having a grain of politeness, and without cultivating the particular acquaintance of any, coolly behaved to all the passengers alike. He was an instance also against the general rule that swearing is absolutely necessary to keep a sailor in order, for as he never swore himself, he constantly rebuked it, and sometimes on a frequent repetition even punished it in those under his care, while at the same time he kept his ship's crew in the utmost discipline. He certainly would have been ranked as a methodistical fanatic had not a favourite toast which he always gave after dinner proved the contrary. Success to the established church, the king, and the British Parliament. They proceeded some weeks in their voyage with favourable wind and weather, when a large ship appeared in sight, and soon crowded all her sails towards them. The captain, hastily summoning the crew and passengers on board, made the following speech. The enemy you see approaching in the famous Algernon pirate, so dreadful in these seas. She is nearly double our force. It's in vain to attempt an escape. We must strike immediately, or... Strike, interrupted Smith. The other answered, Silence, young man, or I'll soon show you who is commander of this vessel. Smith refrained. The other proceeded, We must strike immediately, sink with our vessel, and gain the victory. If we once engage, no mercy is to be hoped for. If we cowardly yield without a blow, still worse off, we shall be slaves for life. Therefore, let every man who loves his freedom more than an infamous wretched being, determine with me to die or conquer. For though they may sink, by the blessing of God they shall never take me. As he concluded, he drew his sword. Every man did the same, and our hero, agreeably surprised, exclaimed, Pardon me, brave sir, you give the orders, and while I can yield this weapon, it shall obey you. The crew huzzaed, and in a few minutes the deck was cleared for action. The enemy seemed surprised at their resistance, and repeatedly as they came up ordered them to strike, to which no answer was returned. The pirate then hoisted a bloody flag and bore down upon them. The captain, who knew they would attempt to board as soon as they could grapple for that purpose, headed himself a party with small arms and cutlasses to oppose them. Smith stood by his side, and the action soon began. The captain of the pirates was a famous mulatto, a tall, gigantic figure, very conspicuous upon the deck. Impatient of delay and conscious of his own personal strength and that of his whole crew, which was composed of bold and hardy villains of all nations, he despised the use of guns and longed to signalize himself on the enemy's deck. The ship soon closed, in defiance of every exertion on the part of the British to prevent it. The crew of both ships furiously engaged from the side of their vessels. Every man was employed to hinder the enemy's boarding, and the firearms were soon exhausted. As the smoke blew away, clearly might you perceive the images of death. Mangled limbs, the brains scattered on the masts, and the gory torrent pouring from the sides. The veil of horror was removed. The noise of the cannon had ceased. and the shouts of the assailants and the groans of the wounded were plainly to be heard. The captain fought opposite to the swarthy mulatto, but the ardour of the engagement had urged Smith more to the right, where a spectacle in the enemy's ship struck him with horror. He beheld a poor fellow naked to the waist and tied to the main mast, while his back showed the stripes that had lately been inflicted. The inhuman cruelty of thus exposing a man to an enemy's fire who was unable to defend himself forcibly struck the honest mind of our youth, and inspired by that impetuous heroism which often marked his character, he sprung upon the enemy's deck. Instantly he smote with his sword the cords that tied the helpless victim, but he had no time to repeat the blow, for though the heat of the battle was at a little distance, some of the pirates instantly flew upon him, and overpowered with numbers, he was gently retreating, when the object of their cruelty, having released himself by the assistance he had received from Smith, came to his aid. The man had picked up a sword upon the deck, and quickly showed that cowardice had not been his fault. Gratitude for his deliverer, revenge towards the rest, animated his arm. Naked as he was, he rushed eagerly to the fight, and our hero, seconded by so able an assistant, no longer thought of retreating. They now successfully maintained their ground. Others soon joined them, and with this reinforcement they at length carried all before them. In the meantime, the brawny mulatto had succeeded in his attack. The captain had fallen before his blows, and a horrid slaughter of the dismayed crew was about to commence, when cries from his own ship recalled his attention. As the bristly lion descends from the cragged mountains, and raging through the green pastures seizes on the lordly bull, the prime of the herd, but if perchance he hears the voice of the keeper hastening to deprive him of his prey, prostrate he leaves the conquered, and foaming with gore, turns to the combat. Not less indignant turned the human savage, enraged to have the victory contested in the moment of success. With a dreadful fury he seeks the fight. On Smith he fixes his blood-exalting eye, and with the grin of determined vengeance stalks towards him. Our hero, not unmoved, sees his powerful antagonist approach, but resolute he waits for him in his own ship. The fight is dreadful. With the utmost caution the young soldier withstands the greedy veteran of blood, now avoiding, now parrying, and now returning the furious blows of the monster. The vast strength and agility of the tawny giant at last prevails, and a deep gash on the left side leaves our hero but small hopes that he can much longer maintain the combat. The blood gushes forth in a stream, and the bastard utters a hideous yell. It pierces to the heart of our hero, a heart supported by no weak ligaments, bound as the tight-traced drum, it recoils not. Prudence and hope indeed forsook him, but courage and despair nerve his sinking arm. No longer careful of defending himself, he thinks only of dying with his adversary. His frame, for a moment like the flash of the expiring torch, seems to possess a double vigour. His trusty sword hails the lucky instant and buries itself in the bosom of his sable enemy. With a deep groan, backward the huge carcass tumbles. Exhausted, without a sigh, our hero falls upon him. The pirates fly, the English sailors pursue. While the combat thus raged between Smith and the mulatto, his naked second bravely maintained the fight with the lieutenant of the other. But when victory hailed the prowess of our youth and the enemy fled, the man whom he had rescued nobly gave his gratitude place before his revenge. Eager, he stooped down and lifted his preserver from the lifeless body of his late antagonist. Our hero's wounds bled violently, and the other tore his shirt, which was still tucked round his waist, and tried to staunch the blood. Smith, who was very weak, looked him full in the face, as expressive of his thanks. "Why, God bless your honour," said the fellow. "This is the second time you've saved me. You made an honest man of me first, and I have found the good of it ever since." Smith, faint as he was, at once recognised the country fellow who had robbed Whiffle and Simms, and as the man lifted him in his arms to carry him into his own ship, Smith shook him cordially by the hand. The battle was over, and quite decisive. The survivors of the pirates were already having their handcuffs put on, and the surgeon and his assistants very busy in dressing the wounded. Our hero's wounds were soon staunched, his new friend carried him into his hammock, and the surgeon decided he might be kept quiet. The captain of the English vessel was more severely hurt. A deep cut on the knee had been the occasion of his falling, and his thigh with great resolution. He had taken off immediately after the battle. Our hero, when a little recovered from the faintness which the loss of blood had produced, clothed his new attendant from his own chest, and then inquired of him how he came into the hands of the pirates. He informed our hero that he had been, from the period when he first commenced sailor, in the king's service, and had, by following the good advice Mr. Smith gave him, acquitted himself with great credit in that station. that having been sent with some others on a cruise in a small frigate, they'd been surrounded by 3 large pirates, that his captain and the other officers had been murdered, and the rest of the crew divided among the different ships. The 3 had been placed in the one now taken. The other 2 men had joined in the engagement, but he himself had been flogged and tied to the mast for refusing to fight against a British vessel. The mulatto, with refined cruelty, had said he would give him his chance at the engagement, and if he survived, he should be whipped to death after it. Smith, in a few days, was sufficiently recovered to be able to walk, and the captain, who was still confined by the dreadful operation he had undergone, desired to speak to him. As soon as our hero came into the cabin, he held out his hand and said, "Let me thank you, sir, for your gallant behaviour the other day, without which I find our success would have been very doubtful indeed. I cannot say I before considered you in so favourable a light. I am intimately acquainted with the commander of the land forces, and my good word shall not be wanting to satisfy him that he is not a braver officer in his whole service." Smith professed himself greatly obliged for his kind intentions, and could have said that he had been equally mistaken as to the other's courage, but he only added that, while the ship's company had their present commander, there was no danger of their being easily conquered. The captain next inquired concerning the English sailor who had behaved so nobly, and said he should come in for his share of the prize. The pirate was very valuable. She had taken many prizes, and particularly 2 small Spanish vessels loaded with bullion. From the captain's cabin our hero ascended upon the deck, where the lieutenant ordered the 2 other Englishmen who had taken in the pirate. The crew welcomed our hero and the sailor who came with him with 3 loud cheers, and the fellows were brought up. Their sulkiness was by this time worn off, and they attempted to excuse themselves by the plea of being compelled. As Smith looked full in their faces, he thought one of them was not quite unknown. They both held down their heads as if fearful of being discovered. He asked them their names, and they hesitated. "I'm certain I remember one of your faces," said he. "This man, I mean." "I have been a rascal long enough," replied the other man, "so I'll tell you all, and perhaps I may do you some good at last." His companion said not a word, and he proceeded. "Your name, sir, I think is Smith. We have been the 2 greatest enemies you ever had. Everything has turned out for your good and to our utter ruin and confusion. This is the man," pointed to his comrade, "through whose false accusation you were so ill used at the fair, by which means the captain noticed you, and he himself was ducked and horsewhipped. You may remember, sir, that while he was robbing the officer the same evening, you rode against him and his party, knocked down the other 2, and followed him into an adjacent field, where you at last left him on the ground. As soon as you were gone, he got up, and lame as he was, and much bruised, reached the London road, and was taken up by the first coach going to the metropolis. In London, I met up with him. We had been before acquainted together, and we now set up an inferior gaming house, carried on many pilfering schemes of that kind. I also had been at the fair. Meeting with some of my old parish, I had inquired what was become of you, and they had pointed you out to me, for my name is Smith. You often heard of me, I'm sure. I'm the man who kept the public house at Pitford, where you were born. Myself and wife plundered your helpless mother immediately after her death, and my wife dressed her in an old gown of her own, that she might deceive the parish officer, while I detained him with the brandy bottle. Your mother, sir, was no poor woman. She was going in the stagecoach from Bristol to London, but taken suddenly ill, she was set down at my door and died a few hours after bringing you into the world. The valuables we found about the lady sold for more than £2,000, and I am certain we were greatly cheated in the sale. This great property proved the ruin of myself, my wife, and at the time infant daughter. We left Pitford soon after, gave ourselves up to every species of idleness and debauchery. The money was soon consumed. In the meantime, I'd associated with gamesters and blacklegs of all kinds, of whom my present partner is the chief, and I may thank him for the many wicked scenes into which I have been led. We had not set up the gaming house in London, which I mentioned, long before we were blown upon, and decamped with all we could collect together. As we had a couple of £100, Lowther planned the scheme of carrying off a rich heiress. The particulars of that, sir, you must remember. Lowther was with the lady in the carriage, and I rode on before to get post horses ready. You rescued the lady, but we returned, and finding our prey was escaped, we should probably have murdered you had not some travellers come to your assistance. Lowther knew you again the moment you came up to the carriage, and as you had ever been his evil genius, was determined to have destroyed you. When our comrade carried you into the cabin, we were having our fetters put on, and we thought we again remembered you, but when you spoke to us this morning, I was no longer in doubt. After your rescue of the young lady, all our schemes had failed, and the officers of justice we knew were out after us. and we accordingly entered ourselves on board a fleet which was going to the Cape. Once more you have prevailed against us, and tired as I am with a wicked, ill-spent and miserable life, I shall no longer wish to retain it, than if I may be, and how the means of discovering your family, who, I am sure, from what I saw of the unhappy lady, are persons of no mean rank. And were there no pocket-books and memorandums? Said Smith eagerly. We destroyed everything but the valuables, which were chiefly diamonds, replied the other. Do no traces remain? Asked our youth, but this little ivory crucifix, drawing it from his bosom and informing the man how he came by it. The fears of a discovery compelled me to burn every trifle belonging to the lady, even to her clothes, which my wife wished to keep. The lady's wedding ring, indeed, we could not get off, and as it was plain gold, we agreed to let it be buried with her. The youth fetched a deep sigh, despairing of ever gaining now any traces of his family. He inquired of the man what was become of his wife, and found she was dead, and thus ended our hero's inquiries concerning his family. With prosperous gales, they soon arrived at the Cape. The captain of the vessel was as good as his word to our hero, and besides promised him that the man who was truly penitent, and whom he had taken into his own ship, should be at liberty to attend him to England if he could be of any service to him in discovering his family, and for the other fellow, Lowther, he himself would take good care that he should no longer be a nuisance to society. Chapter 8, Epigraph. For who with traitors would his safety trust, lest with the wicked heaven involve the just? Though the deep villain scape a while, he feels slow vengeance like a bloodhound at his heels. Swift. Our hero's old acquaintance, whom he had so luckily rescued in the pirate, and whose name was Brown, again and again besought him to permit him to accompany him as a servant. And when Smith candidly told him his income was not sufficient to keep a regular servant, the poor fellow, who could not be refused, enlisted himself in the same regiment, and Smith afterwards took him as his valet. A curious one indeed he was, a raw, rough country fellow, lately metamorphosed into a sailor, and now on a sudden commenced soldier, could be but a very unhandy valet. Yet his good will made up for all his deficiencies, and such was Brown's zeal that his master was satisfied and pleased, and himself perfectly happy in his new servitude. The arch-villain Lowther was tried for piracy and condemned to perpetual servitude. His accomplice at the intercession of the captain of the frigate was, on account of his contrition, permitted to enter in his ship. Immediately after Smith's arrival at the Cape, he was tried by a court-martial for absence from his regiment, and was accordingly found guilty. As soon as the trial was over, he was suspended his rank in the army, and was for one day committed into custody, and then brought up to receive the sentence of the court. The president now informed him that by favour of the recommendatory, and more particularly the exculpatory letters he had brought with him, his readiness to atone for his late absence by joining the regiment, his good conduct before they left England, and his very gallant behaviour on board the ship which the captain had spoken of in the highest terms, for all these considerations the court had thought proper to remit any further punishment, and to reinstate him in that situation which he before enjoyed. It is with the greatest pleasure, concluded the president, I return you this sword, which you have already proved yourself so worthy of. Thus was the unpleasant business happily ended. Our hero, beloved by the soldiers and universally respected by the officers, enjoyed a satisfaction he had not experienced a long time before, and had not the idea of Lady Swain sometimes crossed his mind, few young men had more reason to be so. His new servant daily gained ground in his favour. Gratitude was a strong trait in Brown's character, which was soon heightened to the highest respect and esteem by the beaming virtues of his master. With indefatigable perseverance, Smith applied himself to the duties of his profession, and he had scarcely been at the Cape 3 months before he was rewarded with a company. The liveliness, the agreeable vivacity, the soul-inspiring merriment which once so brightly glowed through the youth, were now all calmed and settled into a steadiness, an eager lust after employment, unusual to one of his years. Captain Smith rose very early, and when not occupied by the regiment, he shut himself in his room, and applied without intermission to his studies. His brother officers saw that a rooted melancholy had seized upon him, and after a few polite, though ineffectual attempts to detain him at the mess, they dropped their idea. Our hero, constantly civil, polite, and obliging to everyone, daily gained ground in their good graces, and though he had few intimates, he possessed the esteem of the whole regiment. His natural animation and fire were hid, not smothered, and when called into action he was like a lion roused from his den that rages with redoubled fury. Soon as the din of battle ceased, hushed were all his passions, and the disappointment of his grand hope pressed heavy upon his mind. Conscious as he was every moment, he reflected that his own follies, his want of resolution to oppose the torrent of dissipation, had been his bane. But though Smith had thus become the victim of his vices, he did not weakly and foolishly, like too many young men, continue in the same bad course, and vainly try to get an antidote from the same. Though he had sucked the poison of the world, he attempted not to make it his food. No, he saw his folly, he confessed he had acted wrong, and he nobly changed his conduct. Captain Smith now frequently wrote and received letters from Mr. Freeman. He had heard that the Duke's eldest son was no more, and that his friend Lord Edward was of course become Marquis of Derry. But this accession of honour and fortune, for his brother's estate came with the title, had not at all diminished his love for the amiable Mary Rozier, and in Smith's last letter from Mr. Freeman he received the pleasing intelligence that his Grace had consented to the match, and was greatly pleased with his new daughter. Captain Smith also received a letter from Sir Harry at Bengal, who proposed soon returning to England and making some stay at the Cape in his way. He heard once from Whiffle, who had written him a most ridiculous though curious letter in his usual style. Whiffle, among a great many other things, sent him the issue of Marmaduke's trial for striking his servant. Marmaduke, with the utmost confidence, came into the court, boasting to everyone he met his certainty of success, but the very methods he had taken to ensure it were, by the finesse of the opposite party, turned against him. He had employed an artful and cunning attorney. The man's character was bad and well known, and greatly injured his cause, particularly with the judge. The eminent counsel, willing to show their abilities, had so bepuzzled a plain, simple story that the jury lost the truth in the clouds of metaphors and ornamental flourishes with which it was surrounded. The counsel, on the other side, by affected honesty, had greatly interested the jury, and the circumstantial tale of two witnesses completed the delusion. "When I was in court," said Whiffle to our hero, his letter is now before me, and I quote from his own words, "I will give you a specimen of lawful ingenuity." "Gentlemen of the jury," said the servant's defender, "the learned counsel on the other side, whose great abilities nothing but the love of truth could induce me to oppose, have endeavoured to invalidate the testimony of the witnesses by calling them common hackney coachmen. One of the witnesses, it is true, gentlemen, is employed by another. There lies his misfortune, not his fault. But he, nevertheless, is a respectable and substantial householder, a citizen of the first city in the world, a citizen of London, an Englishman, born and bred, and what greater title can any of us boast, gentlemen of the jury? The other, if it is necessary to mention it, is all this and more. He drives his own coach. 'Tis true, the coach assists him in gaining an honest livelihood. So too does it many of us. Look at the physician. Does he not, for the same purpose, drive his? I trust, if he laid down his coach, he would soon lose the means of driving. What gives agility to yonder dancing master? What makes the celebrity of his brethren, the fencer and the musician? Their coach, gentlemen, their coach. Let them get rid of their coach, and they get rid of their pupils at the same time. Don't be deceived, gentlemen of the jury, but trust to the plain matter of facts, and you will at once see the enormity, the infamy, the cruelty, alas, my blood runs cold while I speak it, the determined tyranny of this desperate young man, Mr. Marmaduke Pendragon. What? A servant's—" Here I was called out of court, and unluckily lost the rest of the orator's speech. I can only add that it had such an effect upon the jury, together with the strong circumstances adduced on the trial, in which the poor wench was not forgotten. The damages were given to the amount of £500, which, with costs of suit, etc., 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 dipped very deep into another of our friend's thousands. I saw Marmaduke the day after the trial. "Now, Whiffle," said he, "do you call this a fair court of justice that fines me so heavily for a trifling—" Then puzzling for a word, happily for me, he hit upon, "trifling misdemeanour?" "Ah, Marmaduke," I replied, "you have been misled through the whole business. It was a miss first drew you to the porter's house, and it has all proved a miss. Had you not mistaken law for justice, had you not misconstrued power for right, turned truth into a mystery, and misemployed a cunning attorney and knowing advocates, you had probably avoided this mishap. But you chose to attack your adversary with the same weapons. You made yourself a fellow miscreant, and thus missed your mark from beginning to end." "Well," said he, quite indignantly, "you give me puns, Mr. Whiffle, but no reasons. Justice, I say, has used me very ill." "I fear," said I, "that she always will. You played her a very scurvy trick with your cunning attorney and your knowing counsel. And she saw her greatest enemies were your supporters, and you must blame yourself for the consequences. Well then, continued Marmaduke, you won't allow I was ill-used. No, I replied. You thought proper to deal with the devil, and he has paid you in his own coin. Whiffle concluded his letter on a subject he rarely talked or thought of, his own affairs. He was solely dependent on the bounty of an uncle who wished him to take orders and promised to purchase him a good living the moment he was a priest. Whiffle felt himself unequal to the duties of the station and unwilling to enter into it, candidly told his uncle he would rather have a bare competency without orders than a good living with them. The uncle was determined to make a divine of him, and so the affair at present rested. I pass over the particulars of our hero's military conduct and success, through which he was appointed to places of trust and profit, and was able to remit to England the sums he owed there, as master sufficient of a private nature, crowds upon me in the remainder of these papers not to lengthen out my tale by public affairs. Matter sufficient. Apologies. The excellent behaviour of Sir Harry Vallance also in the East Indies for the same cause I omit, and shall only remark that about a year and a half after our hero left England, Sir Harry joined him at the Cape in his way home. He stayed there 3 months, and his affairs particularly demanding his attendance in England, he was looking out for the first vessel, when the governor, wishing to send over a person who would give the ministry a clear and circumstantial account of our present situation in those parts, fixed upon our hero as the most proper man for that purpose. The ship which was appointed to carry our hero was commanded by Captain Clarendon, who had lately arrived from the East Indies. Chapter 8. Epigraph. Yet think not that my muse forbids to love, such thoughts far distant from your bard remove. The lonely maid is like the vine, that knows no friendly elm with tendrils to enclose, but creeps, neglected. Ariosto, Book 10. The time was arrived that was to waft our hero to his native country. Sir Harry wished to go with him, but felt a repugnance to ask anything like a favour of Captain Clarendon. But the friendly interference of Smith soon overcame all difficulties. In the many obliging attentions which it is in the power of a ship to bestow upon his passengers, Captain Clarendon was by no means remiss, and Sir Harry was quickly reconciled to his situation. But there was another cause which, before the end of the voyage, united the former rivals in the truest friendship. Captain Clarendon had a sister named Julia, who at a very early age was married by her parents to a gentleman of very large possessions in the East Indies. He returned to India immediately after his marriage, taking his young wife along with him and proposing to stay there a few years to settle his affairs and remit his valuable property to England. About 2 years after his arrival in India, he died, and left the greater part of his property to his widow. Captain Clarendon arrived at Madras a few months after Mr. Maynard's death, about the time that his sister was preparing to return to England. Happy to be under the protection of a beloved brother, she accompanied him to the Cape and willingly waited there till his frigate was ordered to England. Mrs. Maynard, married at 17 to a man nearly 50, been the greater part of life in the East Indies, could not have supposed to have felt any grievous sorrow for his death. Sir Harry, who had long given over all thoughts of Miss Maitland, was struck with the beauty of the young widow. Whenever he spoke to the fair Julia, his features assumed their former fascinating vivacity. Every cause of enmity with her brother was quite forgotten, and daily more and more satisfied with the sweetness of her disposition, he used his utmost endeavours to ingratiate himself into her favour. His endeavours proved successful, and before the end of the voyage matters were so far adjusted that they only waited their arrival in England to settle the business. His former love for Miss Maitland Sir Harry did not scruple to own, but declared he had given up all thoughts of that lady. While I am on this subject, I will finish this part of my story that it may not interrupt the history of our hero. At the Land's End, Captain Clarendon's vessel parted company with a merchantman that was going to Bristol, and our hero embraced the opportunity of sailing down the Severn and being landed close under the walls of St. Donat's Castle. With mutual professions of esteem and friendship, the gentlemen parted. Captain Smith, happy to see the successful attachment of his friend, accepted with pleasure the warm invitations of all to meet them in London. Sir Harry, as soon as they arrived in England, accompanied Clarendon and his sister to their father's seat in Berkshire, and there received the hand of the lovely young widow. The new married couple proceeded directly to Sir Harry's house in town, and Captain Clarendon promised to join them on the following week. "I have great news to tell you, Clarendon," said Sir Harry to him as soon as he arrived. "That excellent young lady, Miss Maitland, by the death of her uncle and his son, is come into the title and family fortune. She is now Countess of Roxburgh in her own right. I had the pleasure of meeting her yesterday accidentally with the sister of her mother, whom she has nobly provided for, at Julia's aunt's. Captain Clarendon was so amazed he could make no answer. I assure you, brother, said Lady Valence, she looked more beautiful than ever. And inquired, continued her husband, after you. I embraced the opportunity. My dear Julian, your aunt were present, to again solicit my pardon, which she not only graciously accorded, but promised us the favour of a visit this morning. Captain Clarendon, who at the commencement of Sir Harry's speech was sufficiently alarmed, could not now conceal his agitation. Indeed, my dear friends, said he, I must be gone then. There can be no hopes for me, and the sight of of the Countess of Roxburgh will but renew the old flame. Well, God bless you. Good morning to you. You shall see me at dinner. Upon my life, Clarendon, said Sir Harry, laughing, you shan't be so rude. I have... At the moment, a loud rap announced the young Countess. Need I describe the manly perturbation of the amorous sailor? Need I conceal the pleasing surprise of the fair Countess? She affectionately held out her hand to him, called him by the endearing name of her friend, and congratulated him on his happy return. Captain Clarendon was in raptures. He had never, in her former poverty, been treated with half the familiarity, and only the knowledge of her high rank prevented his falling on his knee and once more declaring that he loved none but her. Sir Harry, who wished to bring things to an éclaircissement, walked with his lady out of the room, and Captain Clarendon had scarcely expressed the pleasure he received in her happiness, frequently interrupted by the respectful diffidence of love, before the Countess thus addressed him. I have not the smallest doubt, Captain Clarendon, of the satisfaction you have in my present prosperity, nor shall I ever forget the generous offers you made me when my situation was so very inferior. I was then unwilling to damp your rising hopes by my poverty. But now... The lady hesitated. The joyful sailor spared any further explanation. And will you then, ever beloved of my soul, will you now flatter my presumption if I still aspire to this hand? Will the Countess... Every obstacle is removed, Captain Clarendon, and as I prefer you to all others, and find your esteem for me still the same, no foolish modesty shall prevent my owning it. It is difficult for words to declare the transport of this deserving young man. I shall simply say that he was married to the Countess in less than a month. Large was the fortune of the Countess of Roxburgh. Greater was her birth, still more conspicuous was her beauty, but her goodness far surpassed them all. Long may they bless the generous sailor, noble and due rewards for his love, his constancy, and his virtue.